They say in the high dales of Yorkshire there are secrets buried so deep that even the wind dares not pass over them. 6 years ago, on a fateful Friday afternoon at Tattersall's, a good man was destroyed by a single piece of paper, one signature, and one name. A name that to this very day no soul has dared speak aloud. A Cobblestone stable yard. Morning dew still clinging to the wet grass. 7 servants stand frozen as stone. In the loose box, a black stallion, the one that has snapped the collarbones of 3 grown men since Easter, hisses through bared teeth. No one knows why the young Duke has not slept tonight. No one knows why he paced his guest library from 4 in the morning, brandy untouched at his elbow. And no one, not one soul, understands why he has just dragged a small housemaid out into the center of his ard. A gray dress, wet to the knee. An apron mended 3 times over. A single strand of pale gold hair slipped from its pin, brushing against an ivory cheek. But those gray eyes, those are not the eyes of a girl who scrubs floors for half a wage. Those are the eyes of a woman who once stood at the graveside the only person she ever loved. The eyes of a woman who carries, calloused in the pocket of her apron, a leather-bound notebook. A notebook that, if opened in front of the right crowd, could bring 3 of the greatest houses in England crashing to the ground. She has waited 6 years for this moment. But what she does not know, what she cannot possibly know, is that the man whose hand is now gripping her elbow is the very man whose signature sits at the bottom of the page that destroyed her uncle. The wind moves through the yard. The stallion rolls the white of one eye. And somewhere far away on the long road out of London, a black carriage is already racing toward Blackmoor. The Duke of Blackmoor seized Cordelia by the elbow before she had finished her curtsy, and he walked her toward the stallion, the one that had broken 3 grooms since Easter. She did not pull away. She did not speak. She let him march her across the gravel of the upper yard, past the dairymaids with their open mouths, past the head groom's frozen hand on a halter rope, past the boy who was meant to be sweeping cobbles and had forgotten the broom entirely. Her gray dress was wet to the knee from the morning grass. Her apron strings bore 3 stitched repairs. A strand of pale gold hair had slipped its pin near her temple, and it brushed her cheek as he marched her forward, and she did not push it back. She was 26. Ivory-skinned, tired in the bones. In a way nobody, looking, would have guessed. And she did not look like a woman about to be humbled. She looked like a woman counting fences, deciding which she would clear, and which she would not trouble with at all. The stallion was called Goliath. He rolled the white of one eye and laid his ears flat. 17 hands at the shoulder. Black as polished coal, with a star like a dropped lantern between his eyes. He had thrown the Duke's best rider at the Easter trials and snapped the man's collarbone in 2 clean places. He had refused saddle, refused bridle, refused the farrier in every combination a clever man could attempt. The head groom, an old fellow named Locksley, had spent 4 mornings begging his lordship to sell the brute to a traveling circus before it killed somebody, probably her. His lordship had not listened. His lordship was not that morning in the habit of listening. "You will mount him," the Duke said. He had not released her elbow, my lord. "You will mount him. You will hold your seat for 1 circuit of the yard, and then you will dismount. And you will tell every soul on this estate that the wisdom of stable boys is no concern of housemaids." A pause. "Do you understand me?" It was not a question. He left no room in it for an answer. Cordelia looked up at him. And here is what she saw. Ambrose Carow, 8th Duke of Blackmoor, 28 years old, with the height and the breadth of a man who spent his autumns hunting in the Highlands and the rest of the year outdoors with horses. A coat of deep indigo wool, a cravat the color of fresh cream, hair the warm dark brown of chestnut steeped too long in tea, a jaw a sculptor would have argued over, and gray eyes. The kind that looked cool and clear from a distance, and went the color of a storm coming in when he was angry, which he had been since 7 o'clock that morning, because at 7 his steward had reported overhearing a kitchen maid tell a stable boy that the colt called Atlas had a throat infection coming on, and ought not be worked, and the colt called Atlas had developed a throat infection by noon. The Duke had not slept since. He had paced his library at dawn. He had decided that whatever this maid was, she not in his household making fools of his stable master and his head farrier. Men, he paid handsomely, men who were meant to know more about his animals than a girl with a scrubbing pail. So he had resolved to humble her in the only currency she seemed to traffic in. He had not slept enough to think the plan all the way through. This is worth remembering about the Duke. My lord, Cordelia said again. And her voice was not the voice of a woman about to make a scene. It was low, quiet, almost gentle, with a clean Yorkshire vowel sitting under the polish like a stone under still water. If I mount him in this skirt, I will tear it, and the housekeeper will dock my wages. I will pay for the skirt, but I shall require a leg up, my lord. He is too tall for me to spring. He stared at her. He had been prepared for tears. He had been prepared for fainting, for a flat refusal. He had even, somewhere beneath the anger, half hoped for the refusal, because a refusal would have let him send her away and be done. He had not been prepared for practical questions. He found he had nothing in his mouth that could be released as a sentence. So he set both hands at her waist, and he lifted her, and her hands closed on the stallion's black mane as she settled astride. She did not arrange her skirts. She did not fuss with her grip. She did not reach for the reins, which dangled unbuckled from a snaffle nobody had managed to fasten. She simply settled her weight, all 8 stone of it, into the small of that great black animal's back, as though she were settling onto a chair by the kitchen fire. She breathed out. Once, slowly, through her nose, Goliath's ears came forward. The dairymaids made a small soft sound, none of them aware they had made it. Cordelia leaned. A hair, toward his right shoulder. The stallion turned. He walked. He walked the upper yard, at a measured, collected walk that would have made a drilling sergeant weep into his sleeve, his great neck arched, his ears twitching at the rhythm of her quiet body. She clicked her tongue, the smallest click, and he picked up a long trot. She closed her left knee a hair tighter. He balanced. She drew the smallest breath inward. He halted, exactly at the Duke's boots, and lowered his head, and breathed warm into the wool of the Duke's lapel. Silence in the upper yard. The kind of silence that has weight to it. Cordelia slid down. Her skirt did not tear. She had taken it up neatly under her sash before he had thought to look. She handed him the strand of mane she had held, the way a child hands a found rabbit to its mother. My lord, she said, I beg leave to return to my duties. The first floor still wants polishing, and cook will be looking for me at past. She curtsied, and she walked toward the kitchen door, as straight-backed leaving as she had been arriving, and the Duke of Blackmoor stood in the cold spring sunshine, with the breath of his unrideable stallion soft against his cravat, and watched her go, and discovered that the burning under his collar was not anger anymore. He could not, just then, name what it had become. Locksley found his voice first. He asked very carefully whether his lordship would like the stallion put up. The Duke did not answer. He set his hand on Goliath's neck instead, and the stallion did not flinch. The stallion leaned into the touch. The way a hound leans into a knee. The Duke had owned that horse 2.5 years. The horse had never leaned into anything in its life. He recovered himself, after a long while, enough to issue 2 quiet instructions. He wanted every account of every household servant hired in the last 12 months brought to his study before luncheon. And he wanted not one word of this in the village. Locksley looked at the dairymaids, who were already vanishing back into the dairy with the hectic energy of women carrying news they meant to deliver before the noon bells. He looked at the wide-eyed sweeping boy, still without his broom. He looked at the kitchen door, just shut behind a small straight-back maid in a wet gray dress, and he inclined his head, with the resignation of a man who had managed horses for 40 years and accepted decades ago that he could not manage gossip. He would do what he could. It would not be enough. He knew that already, what Locksley did not say, what he would never say to his lordship's face. was that he had watched that ride from the halter rope with his old heart in his old throat, and that in 40 years he had seen perhaps 3 pull, sit a difficult animal the way the gray-dressed girl had sat Goliath, and that 2 of them were dead, and the third had taught the second. He had a thought, watching her go. Small, cold, unwelcome, that hands like that are not made in a village. That hands like that are made on a heath. He put the thought away, the way an old man puts away a thing he is not ready to look at. And he went to see about the stallion. Cook did not shout. Cook never shouted. Cook set down the wooden spoon she had been beating eggs with, and looked at Cordelia over the rims of her spectacles. For exactly as long as it took to make a kitchen of 7 people go entirely still, there was a story in her still room, Cook said, which she did not propose to repeat in front of the undercook. There was a second story in the dairy, which had reached the pantry, the laundry, and as of 3 minutes ago the gardener's boy. And there was a third coming up the back corridor on the legs of Mrs. Pelham, the housekeeper. And Mrs. Pelham, Cook observed, was not a woman she proposed to keep waiting. Cordelia stood with her hands folded over her apron, her eyes resting a polite half-inch above Cook's left shoulder. His lordship asked me to ride a horse. I rode the horse. I have come back to polish the first floor. Cook had buried 2 husbands and a son. She had run a kitchen in every great house between Carlisle and York. She looked at Cordelia a long quiet second. Polish the first floor, Miss Hayward. Begin in the long gallery. And do not, under any circumstances, walk past the open door of his lordship's study. A pause over the eggs. There'll be a hot dinner at 4. And, Cordelia, the kitchen held its breath. Whoever you were before you came here is no business of mine. Polish well. Cordelia allowed herself, for the first time that morning, one small private pulse of feeling somewhere behind her sternum. She inclined her head. And here is the thing she did not let Cook see, the thing she let no one see, that those flat words, whoever you were is no business of mine, were the kindest spoken to her in 6 years. Because they asked her for nothing. Because they did not pry. Because they were the words of a woman who had also, at some point in her long hard life, needed someone not to ask. She fetched the beeswax, the soft cloths, the long-handled brush, and she went up the back stairs, and she did not let her hands tremble, even when she was entirely alone. The long gallery ran 140 feet along the south wing. It held the portraits and a yellowing parquet floor that smelled. When the spring sun warmed it through the tall sash windows, exactly like her childhood. Beeswax, dust, lavender from the linen press across the corridor, and the faint mineral cool of stone behind the wainscot. She knelt at the south end. She set out her cloths. She began at the skirting and worked her way up. The light fell in long lemon rectangles across the floor, and it broke against the painted ankles of the gentlemen in the portraits, who watched her without comment. Some of them, she thought, would have been displeased to see a maid in this gallery polishing badly. None of them, she suspected, had ever met a maid in this gallery polishing well. And as she worked, she let her mind go where she did not, as a rule, permit it to go. To Newmarket, to the heath at first light, the mist lying in the hollows, and the strings of horses coming up out of it like ships out of fog. To a man with a notebook and a soft voice, who had let a small grave girl in a pinafore hold the watch and call the furlongs, who had taught her to read a horse the way other men taught their daughters to read scripture, who had said, more than once, that she had a better eye at 12 than half the touts at Tattersall's had at 50. Her uncle. She had not said his name aloud in 6 years. She did not say it now, but she let herself think it. Once. Here, in the warm beeswax light, with the painted gentleman watching, and no living soul to see her face. She let herself think how he would have laughed this morning. The young Carrow boy, all grown into his title, and not one whit wiser about a horse than he had been at 20. Then she folded the thought away, and went on polishing. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the Duke of Blackmoor was, at that very moment, standing at the window of his study, watching her cross the inner court below, a glass of brandy in his hand that he had poured and not touched. He had stood there 40 minutes. With an expression his valet, arriving at 2:20 with a fresh cravat, had taken one look at, and decided not to disturb. He summoned her at 3. She came in her plain gray, apron freshly tied, the smell of beeswax under her nails. The studs was high-ceilinged and lined with horse paintings, a Stubbs on the south wall, a hunting scene over the mantel, and a small unsigned watercolor above the desk, which she recognized at once, and chose not to look at twice because she had painted it. She had been 11. A dappled gray foal with a white star, drawn from life in a north paddock at first light, while her uncle held the foal's dam, and told her to mind the line of the hawk. She had given it to the young Carrow boy, the day his first colt came home a winner. She had not known then that a duke would keep a child's watercolor above his desk for 15 years. She knew it now, and it frightened her more than anything else in the room. There was a fire. There was a tea tray. There was a single chair on her side of the great mahogany desk, which she did not sit in. Because no maid sat in the presence of her master, the Duke did not ask her to sit. He let her stand in the warm saisona a long moment before he spoke. The clock struck 3:30 with a small flat note. A coal shifted in the grate, and Cordelia counted 4 breaths in the slow, careful rhythm she had practiced 6 years ago. On the morning she had stood for the first time before a house steward at her first place of service, and answered every question without letting her face give him anything at all. "Whose daughter are you?" the Duke asked. "The daughter of a Yorkshire schoolmaster, my lord. He passed when I was 12, and your mother, the schoolmaster's wife. She did not survive him long, and the years between. I have been in service." Oh wait, all of them? All of them. She did not elaborate. He had sat in 3 parliaments. He had owned 11,000 acres. He had sat across a table from a French diplomat for 90 unbroken minutes during the closing of a treaty. He had never, in his life, met a silence as polite and as immovable as Cordelia Hayward standing on the other side of his desk with her hands folded and her eyes on the 3rd button of his waistcoat. "You ride," he observed. "I do. You ride very well. My father kept a small mare for the village. My lord, I exercised her on the lanes." He set his pen down. "Goliath," he said dryly, "is not a small village mare." "No, my lord." Then how? She did not answer that one. Not directly, she told him, instead, in a voice that did not change, that the stallion was underweight in the hind quarters, because he was worked at full ration on cracked corn, when he had the digestion of a thoroughbred. "He ought to be on bran mash twice a week," she said, "and rolled oats only there. But I imagine your stable master is aware of that, my lord." The Duke set his pen down, very carefully. "On its little tray, Miss Hayward, my lord. That is not the answer of a schoolmaster's daughter. It is the answer of a woman who has paid attention. It is the answer," the Duke said slowly, "of a woman trained on Newmarket Heath." She did not answer that either, but something moved behind her eyes. Quick. Gone again. He had in the past 2 hours sent for the household ledger and the housekeeper's file of references, and he had read that one Cordelia Hayward had been engaged at Blackmoor 11 months ago, on the recommendation of a milliner in York. The milliner had written only that the girl was honest, dexterous, and willing to work for half a wage with no afternoons off half a wage. No afternoons. A woman who did not want to be seen. "You will," he said, "do me the courtesy of not pretending you are an ordinary maid." She lifted her eyes. For the first time, they were gray, the clear, level gray of a winter sky over a stone wall, and they met his without flinching. "I am extraordinarily a maid, my lord. I am a maid extraordinarily well. If you find that intolerable, I will collect my character and be on the carrier's cart by morning." "That is not what I said."
"It is what your lordship said."
A small, hot silence stood across the polished mahogany. The Duke did not move. Cordelia did not move. The clock ticked through 20 full seconds in which neither looked away. He was the first to lower his eyes to the open ledger. To a name in the 3rd column he had stared at for 20 minutes, without absorbing a single letter of it, and he told her, at last, in a voice carefully emptied of everything he felt, that she might return to her duties. She curtsied, she withdrew. The door shut softly behind her. And the Duke of Blackmoor listened to the retreat of her steps along the carpeted gallery, for as long as he could distinguish them, and then somewhat longer, and then he put both hands flat on the desk, and bowed his head. He sat a long time looking up at the watercolor, the dappled gray foal, the white star, the north paddock at first light. The signature in the corner was a child's looped hand, C. Hayward. His old master had given it to him, the late Frederick Hayward, of Newmarket, on the occasion of the Duke's first colt to a winning post. He remembered the day, the cold, and the cheering and the smell of bruised turf, and a small grave girl in a pinafore, horsehair on her cuffs, who had pressed the rolled watercolor into his hands and run away before he could thank her. Frederick Hayward had had a niece. The Duke remembered her now. He had met her once more. At the celebration dinner that same evening, when she was 12, fen serious and had poured the syllabub. He had spilled some on his father's good cravat. And the old man, Frederick, not his father, had laughed and said the young Carrow boy had the right hands and the wrong friends, and that he would do very well in life. If he got rid of the friends, the Duke sat with his hand over his mouth, and the cold spring afternoon went slowly past his window. He had got rid of one friend in the end, or the friend had got rid of him when the trough ran dry and there was nothing left to take. But not before, not in time. Not before a single careless afternoon had set a chain of small, bright dominoes falling that had ended. He understood this now, with a cold and total clarity that made the brandy taste like ash, that had ended with a girl in a gray dress scrubbing his floors for half a wage. He did not yet know the whole shape of it. He only knew the floor had shifted under him, and that it had not finished shifting. There was a child at Blackmoor, Lady Beatrix Carrow, 10 years old, the orphaned daughter of the Duke's late elder brother, and she had appointed herself to Cordelia's company within 14 hours of Cordelia's arrival the previous spring. She had been deposed, briefly, when her cousin discovered the friendship and ordered the governess to keep her at her French verbs in the mornings. She had been reinstated within a week, because Lady Beatrix Carrow, at 10, already possessed the political instincts of a duchess and the persistence of a pony with an unbarred door. She found Cordelia in the long gallery at 4:30. She had ridden Goliath, Beatrix announced, without preamble, without greeting. The way she announced most things, she would not be told otherwise. The second housemaid had told the first. The first had told the governess. The governess had told the boot boy, and the boot boy had informed Lady Beatrix at 12 minutes past noon. Cordelia said quietly that she had been instructed not to speak of it. By whom? By Cook. Beatrix waved this away. As a matter of the very gravest importance, she was the Duke's ward. Cordelia was her friend. Cordelia had done a great and historic thing, and she required to know whether her cousin had been an ass about it. Cordelia set down the cloth. She knelt and tied Beatrix's left bootlace, which had come undone some time ago, and had been distressing the child's dignity considerably. His lordship, she said carefully, has been a duke about it. Beatrix translated this. With the unsentimental clarity of a 10-year-old, it meant an ass. She wished to know whether Cordelia had done it on purpose. Had she ridden the stallion, knowing she would shame him, in front of all his stablemen, knowing he would stand at his window at 3 feeling he had behaved very badly indeed? Cordelia tied the second lace. She straightened. The child's face was small and serious and fierce and dirty. In the particular places along the jaw that 10-year-olds favor, I rode the stallion because I was told to ride the stallion. I am paid by his lordship to do as I am told. Beatrix, untroubled by the metaphysics of this, observed that Cordelia was paid £8 a year, and that her cousin could double it tomorrow. Cordelia agreed that he could. Would you let him? Cordelia gathered her cloths. She tucked one under her arm. She looked down at the small fierce child, and she felt, for the first time in 6 years, since the Friday at Tattersall's when one man had ruined her uncle, and her name, and her future, all in a single stroke, A small, uncomplicated wish, Lady Beatrix. I will let your cousin do the things that make sense. I will not let him do the things that do not. I have learned the difference. Beatrix considered this, and nodded once. As a duchess would. He likes you, you know. Cordelia's hands closed on the cloths. Lady Beatrix. Your cousin has not yet decided what he thinks of me. It would be improper of me to have an opinion in advance of his lordship's. He likes you, said the small, dirty, serious child, because he could not stop looking out of the window. The whole morning, Cordelia did not answer that. She had no answer that was safe. She was in the stables at first light, because she could not sleep. She had lain awake in the small dim room above the kitchens, the one she shared with a chambermaid named Annie and a kitchen girl named Bess, listening to Annie's slow breathing, and the tick of the iron bedstead, and the small wet ticking of an early rain on the slate above her head. She had thought of her uncle. She had thought of her own 2 hands. She had thought of the Duke's hands at her waist, lifting her, and how lightly he had done it. As though her weight had not surprised him in the least, she had thought of his eyes going storm-colored in the courtyard, and of his eyes, immediately after, going still. At 3 she gave up. At 1/4 she pulled on her dress, and her stockings, and her boots in the dark, careful not to wake Annie. And she took the back stairs in her stocking feet, and put her boots on at the bottom. It was the kind of dawn the Yorkshire dales give grudgingly in late April. A slow blue hush over the wet hay, a cold hush in the rafters, the smell of clean straw and warm bran, and the low, contented groan of a stall door working on its hinges. Somewhere, up in the high beams, a barn owl that had not yet tired turned its great pale face, and watched her come in, and decided, after private deliberation, that she did not signify. She went to Atlas's stall, because the colt brewing a throat infection the morning before would by now be running a hard fever. He was. She heard it before she saw him. The low, rasping pull, the small, wet click at the back of the throat that meant the inflammation had passed from the ducts into the airway proper. She let herself in. The colt knew her. She had been quietly leaving him a half-handful of cooked linseed every other afternoon for a month. On her way back from emptying the slop pail, he pressed his fevered nose into her shoulder and let her open his mouth, and his throat was red as a live coal, and his glands the size of plums. She went to the medicine cupboard, it was unlocked, which she had known. She made up a steam. Boiling water from the small forge stove, eucalyptus oil from a brown bottle, a fistful of dried thyme she had set by herself the previous September, and a dose of belladonna in 12 drops of brandy, because the colt's pulse ran thready under his jaw. She covered him with a clean blanket. She set the bucket of steam beneath his nose and tented a sack over his head and her own. And she was crouched there, breathing eucalyptus and warm horse and wet straw, when a man's quiet voice spoke behind her in the stall door. Miss Hayward, she did not jump. She finished what she was doing. She did not lift the sack until she had counted to 30, and the colt's nostrils had stopped flaring. The Duke of Blackmoor was in his shirt sleeves. She had never seen him in his shirt sleeves. He had come straight from his bed, his hair uncombed, his cravat nowhere to be seen, the linen open at the throat and folded across the breast in a way that said he had pulled it on himself without troubling his valet. A glass of brandy in one hand, because he had not yet been able to face the morning sober, and a riding crop in the other, because he had been on his way to Goliath. He looked, Cordelia thought, from very far away inside herself, less like a duke, and more like a man. He asked her, in a voice held tight, what in God's name she thought she was doing. Steaming Atlas, my lord. The colt is running the throat infection I mentioned to the stable boy yesterday. He observed that she was dosing his colt with belladonna, 12 drops in a spirit base. The colt will not feel it. He is 200 guineas of thoroughbred running a hard fever, my lord, and the alternative is calling the farrier surgeon from Beverley, who is 90 minutes' ride away, and will charge you a guinea besides. The Duke set the brandy down, very deliberately. On where did a housemaid learn to compound a steam from eucalyptus, brandy, and 12 drops of belladonna? She did not answer. Miss Hayward, where? The lamp uttered in the cold draught from the open door. The colt's breathing, under the steam, had begun to ease. The Duke did not move. And Cordelia straightened, and set the empty bottles back in the cupboard, and closed it, and turned to face him in the dim blue light, and 6 years of silence reached the end of itself. At Newmarket, my lord, on the heath. In the spring of the year I turned 15. From a man who had been compounding it for 40 years, and who had used the very same steam on a Derby winner the year before they struck his name out of the books. A breath. As you very well know, the Duke put his hand against the door jamb. He breathed in, once, slowly. And he looked to Cordelia, very much like a man who had ridden through a long night to arrive somewhere he had not expected to be. Frederick Hayward, he said, was my master. Yes, he gave me my first winner. Yes. A pause. I was there. I poured the syllabub. You billed sums on your father's cravat, and my uncle laughed, and told me afterward that the young Carrow boy had the right hands, and the wrong friends. The Duke closed his eyes. When he opened them, something in his face had come apart very quietly. The way ice gives way under a slow thaw, without a sound. All at once, Cordelia, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it land. Somewhere behind her sternum, my lord. Why are you scrubbing my floors? And she told him, quietly, in the blue dawn, with the fevered colt, breathing easier between them. Because the man who ruined my uncle is a friend of every great house between London and York. And I have learned that the only safe place for the niece of Frederick Hayward is below the level at which men like him bother to look. I have lived below that level 6 years, my lord. I had 3 weeks left on my engagement here. I would have been gone, and your lordship would have remained in comfortable ignorance of me. She drew a breath, and here was the thing she had not meant to say, and said anyway, and I would have been in another county, before Sir Crispin Vane rode through your gates next month, for the spring meeting, which he is, my lord, planning. To do, the Duke went very still. I read his letter to your steward, by accident, in February, when I was emptying a wastepaper basket, and for a long moment, in the cold blue stable, neither of them said anything at all. The owl turned its great pale face in the rafters. The colt sighed, and outside, beyond the open door, the first thin line of gold came up over the eastern hills, and touched the wet slate roofs of Blackmoor, and turned them, for one held breath of a moment, the color of something about to begin. The Duke offered her the position before the sun had fully cleared the hills. He offered it badly. He stood in the doorway, brandy forgotten on the corn bin, and told her she would not be on the carrier's cart by morning, that she would not be in another county by spring, that she would never again be made to hide. Not for one further day. She tried to interrupt. He did not let her. He told her, with the dry deliberation of a man who had been working the sentence over for hours, and had only just hit upon its plain form, that the previous morning he had lifted his dressmaster's niece onto a stallion for the express purpose of humiliating her, in front of 7 of his servants, and that he had been awake since 2 trying to compose the apology he was about to pay her. She began to say he owed her no apology. He cut her off. Gently, he owed her, he said, an apology of considerable size, and then he asked her to take charge of his stables. She refused. Without hesitation, I am not a man, my lord. Your stable master is. And the day you set a maid over him in the yard is the day Mr. Locksley resigns his place and writes a letter to the sporting magazine that ruins us both. He asked, then, under what terms she would stay. She looked at him. She looked at the dawn coming pale and blue through the high window. She looked at her own hand, which she did not particularly wish to remove from, where it had somehow come to rest near his, under the terms of a salaried stable assistant, openly, not under Mr. Locksley, beside him, answerable to your lordship alone, £25 a year, a small room of my own off the saddle store, with a key, a breath, and one further condition, on which I will not yield, name it, that when Sir Crispin de Vane arrives at your gate next month, you will not pretend you do not know who I am." He thought about it for the space of 2 breaths, and he agreed. What neither of them said, what hung in the cold dawn air like the steam off the colt, was that she had named Vane twice now, and that each time the Duke's face had done a thing he could not control. A small flinch, a tightening at the eyes. The flinch of a man who has heard a name he had hoped never to hear again. Cordelia saw it. She filed it away. She did not yet know what it meant, but she had spent 6 years learning to read the faces of powerful men, and the Duke's face when she said Vane was the face of a man who was afraid. Not of Vane, of her finding something out. She moved her things into the small room off the saddle store at noon. There was almost nothing to move. A canvas valise that had once been her uncle's. A wooden box with a blue ribbon worn pale that had been her mother's. A bundle of letters she had not opened in 5 years. A pair of riding gloves wrapped in oiled cloth, and a small leather-bound notebook with the looped C. Hayward on the inside cover. The pages close written in pencil. Diagrams of equine pasterns, feed proportions, case notes on respiratory complaints in 2-year-olds, the corners dog-eared from 6 years of consultation in the dark. By Cobblestone, she set the notebook at the foot of the narrow bed. She set the gloves on top of it, where she could see them, and she stood at the high window a moment and laughed. Once, very quietly, into her own sleeve, because the Duke's youngest stable boy had been sent to air the room. And the boy, on his own initiative, had set a lavender bag on the pillow. The room was 12 feet by 9. A single high window facing east over the inner court, a narrow iron bed, a deal washstand, a small cracked pier glass on the far wall, the walls whitewashed plaster gone slightly cream with age, the floor scrubbed boards. She stood in the doorway with her uncle's valise in one hand and her mother's box in the other, and she looked at the lavender bags several seconds before she set down her things and crossed to the window and leaned out into the cool spring air. It was the first room she had been able to lock from the inside in 6 years. She had not understood, until that moment, how much a key could weigh. The trouble began 9 days later. It began with a mare. Her name was Juno. A bay thoroughbred, 15 years in the Carrow stables, in foal to a Godolphin stallion, and carrying what every man on the estate believed would be the finest colt Blackmoor had bred in a generation. She was the Duke's pride. She was Locksley's pride. She was, in the careful arithmetic of a great breeding house, worth more than the house itself. And on the 9th morning of Cordelia's new position, Juno would not stand. She stood in the corner of her box with her head low, and her flanks heaving, and a fine tremor running down her hindquarters that had no business being there. And she would not take water, and she would not take feed. And when Cordelia knelt at her side in the gray light and laid a hand against the great warm barrel of her belly, she felt the foal inside kick. Once. Hard, and then go terribly, terribly still. Locksley came at a run, and he took one look at Cordelia kneeling in the straw beside his dying mare. And his face went white, and then it went hard. "What did you give her?" "Nothing, Mr. Locksley." "I have given her nothing. You've been at that cupboard since the day you came, dozing colts at first light, playing surgeon. What did you give her?" "Nothing, steady, even, though her hands had begun at last to shake. I came to check on her, as I check on all of them. Mr. Locksley, the mare is poisoned." The word hung in the cold air of the box, poisoned. And Locksley laughed, a short, ugly bark of a laugh. The laugh of a man at his trade, 40 years being told his trade by a girl in a borrowed position who had held it 9 days. "Poisoned," he repeated. "Look at her gums. I don't take instruction. Look at her gums." And something in her voice. Some flat command that did not belong to a housemaid and did not belong to a stable assistant, either, but to a person who had stood at the dying animals before, and won, sometimes and lost, sometimes, and learned the difference in the lifting of a lip. Locksley looked. The mare's gums were the dark brick red of an animal whose blood had gone wrong. And there was a froth at the corner of her mouth that smelled, faintly, beneath the straw and the sweat, of something bitter, something green. something that did not grow in any decent pasture. Cordelia knew at the moment the smell reached her, because there was nothing on God's earth more deadly to a horse than you. And there was no ewe within a half-mile of the Blackmoor paddocks, because every breeding man in England knew to grub it out by the roots, which meant someone had brought it in, someone had put it in the mare's feed, on purpose. The Duke arrived as the second hour turned, and what followed was the longest night Blackmoor had seen in a generation. They worked her in shifts that were not shifts. Because nobody left. Cordelia mixed charcoal and linseed, and forced it down the mare's throat by the handful, against the contractions that had started early and wrong. Locksley held the great head in his lap on the straw, and spoke to her the way a man speaks to something he has loved 15 years. The Duke stood in the doorway in his shirt-sleeves with a lantern, and gave not a single order, because for once in his life he understood he was not the most useful person in the room. And toward 3 in the morning the foal came. It came too early, and it came wrong, and it did not, but the mare did. She lived. She lived because a girl who had been a housemaid 11 days before knelt in the bloody straw with her sleeves rolled to the shoulder and her pale hair gone dark with sweat, and did not stop. Not when Locksley said it was hopeless. Not when the Duke's face told her the same. She did the slow, brutal, patient work of pulling a horseback from the edge of a thing, inch by inch, hour by hour, until the gray dawn came up cold over the wet slate roofs, and the mare lifted her head and took water. And Locksley, who had been 40 years in the stables, who had buried more horses than he could name, who had wanted this girl gone from the first morning she rode his master's Unrideable Stallion and made him a fool. Locksley put his face in his hands, in the straw, and wept, and when he had finished he stood, and he looked at Cordelia across the body of the foal they had lost and the mare they had saved. And he said, "I owe you nothing, Miss Hayward." "You owe me nothing, Mr. Locksley." "I do." A long pause. The hardest words a proud old man owns. "I thought you'd come to take my place." "I see now you came to save it." And he held out his hand, and Cordelia Hayward, who had gone 6 years without anyone bothering to offer her a hand, took it. That was the night the war turned, because by the following afternoon, the Duke had found the ewe. He found it the way he found most things now, by going where Cordelia told him to look. There was a stable lad, a new one, hired in March. A sullen, watchful boy named Finch, who had kept to the far end of the yard, and had been seen by the youngest sweeping boy carrying a sack from the southern wood 3 mornings running. And in Finch's berth, beneath the straw of his own thin pallet, they found the rest of it, cut ewe, wrapped in sacking, and a letter. The letter was unsigned, but it was written on heavy cream paper no stable lad in England could have afforded, and it instructed the boy, in cool, precise terms, that the bay mare was the most valued animal in the Blackmoor stables, and that her loss, before the spring meeting, would do a great deal to remind a certain duke that his judgment in matters of horseflesh, and in matters of household, was not to be trusted. There was a figure named, a sum, to be paid on completion. Cordelia read the letter standing in the cold yard, and she did not need a signature. She knew the hand. She had read it before, in February. Over a wastepaper basket. Vain, she said. And the Duke took the letter from her fingers, and read it himself, and his face went the color of a storm coming off the North Sea. "He has not arrived," the Duke said, very low. "He has not even ridden through my gate. And already he is reaching into my house, to break what I love," and he did not seem to notice that he had said it, what he loved, but Cordelia noticed. She noticed, and she said nothing, and she looked away across the wet yard, because there was a feeling rising in her chest that she had spent 6 years learning to put down, and she put it down, because there were 3 weeks until the spring meeting, and there was a man coming, and feelings, she had learned, were a thing you could not afford when there was a man coming. The boy Finch was gone by vanished in the night the moment he understood the letter had been found, run back to whatever pocket he'd been hired out of. And the household, which loved gossip more than bread, somehow kept this one quiet. because every soul at Blackmoor had loved that mare too, and there are some kinds of grief that even gossip will not touch. The day's warm spring came on properly. The hawthorn in the lanes went white with mayflower. The foals that had lived ran their long-legged circles in the paddocks, and in the small room off the assault store, a box of books appeared one afternoon while Cordelia was at the far paddocks, Stubbs, Marshall, an old much-thumbed Bracken on equine medicine, and one volume she had not held in 6 years, her uncle's own, privately printed. Notes on the conformation of the English thoroughbred, the spine cracked from his own thumbing, and the flyleaf inscribed in his own hand, to Ambrose. Who is the right hands? She sat down on the narrow bed, because her knees had stopped being reliable, and Lady Beatrix, who had followed her in, climbed up beside her and took her hand, and observed, with the unsentimental clarity of a 10-year-old, that Cordelia was crying. "I am sitting," Cordelia said. "You are sitteth, and your eyes are wet." Which is crying. It is a sort of crying, the sort that does not require attention. "My cousin," said Beatrix, "is not very good at saying he is sorry. He likes to send things instead. When he forgot my birthday last Christmas, he sent a pony." Cordelia laughed, wetly, into her sleeve and told her gently that books were quite enough. They were not quite enough, but they were a great deal. The thing she did not say, even to herself, was that she had begun to wait for the sound of his step in the yard, and that frightened her more than you, more than Vane, more than anything that came in a sack from a southern wood. Because a man who reaches into your house to break what you love is a danger you can name. And a man who sends you your dead uncle's book, inscribed by your own uncle's hand, is not. The confession came on a Thursday. She would remember that after. That it had been a Thursday. An ordinary gray, drizzling Thursday, with the yard slick and shining, and the horses steaming in their boxes. He found her in the saddle store, oiling a bridle, and he stood in the doorway a long while saying nothing, which was not like him. The Duke of Blackmoor was a man who entered rooms talking. "Miss Hayward, my lord. There is a thing I have to tell you, and I find I would rather face Vane himself, with pistols, at dawn, than tell you this thing." She set the bridle down, because there is a particular stillness a person goes into, when they understand that the next 60 seconds are going to cost them something. And she had gone into it. "Then tell me, my lord," and he did. He told her that he had been 22, and newly come into the title, and dazzled, in the way only a young man with too much money and too little judgment can be dazzled, by the company of Sir Crispin Vane, who had been older and polished and exact, and who had taken the young Duke under his wing the way a hawk takes a smaller bird under its shadow, and that there had been a document, a bill of sale, for a colt whose pedigree had been adjusted, on paper, in a hand that was not Vane's, so nothing could ever be traced to Vane, and that Vane had asked the young Duke, as a friend, as a trusted friend, to witness the signature, to put his own name, his ducal name, his unimpeachable name, to the bottom of the page, and the young Duke had done it because he had not read it, because he hadn't 22. And it had been a Tuesday, and there had been a dinner he was late for, and that document, that bill of sale, with the Duke's name witnessed, was the very document that 2 years later was used to destroy Frederick Hayward of Newmarket, the man who had taught him to ride, the man who had given him his first winner, the man whose niece was standing in front of him now, in a saddle store, in the rain, with an oiled bridle going slack in her hands. "I did not know," the Duke said, and his voice broke on the last word, and he did not try to hide it. "I swear before God, Cordelia, I did not know what I was signing. I have carried it 6 years, and every day of those 6 years I told myself it could not be undone. Until you walked into my house, and rode my horse, and I understood I had been telling myself a coward's lie. Silence in the saddle store, the rain taunts in the slates, a horse shifting in a far box, and Cordelia stood very still, and felt the whole structure of the last 11 months tip and slide, because the man she had let herself, against all her own rules, begin to wait for, was the man whose name was at the bottom of the page that ended her uncle. She set the bridle on its hook. "Very carefully, I think, my lord," she said, and her voice was the flat, polite voice from her first morning. The voice that gave nothing. The voice from 6 years of giving nothing. "I think I would like to be alone now, Cordelia, my lord. Please," and he went. Because, for once, the Duke of Blackmoor understood that the most powerful thing a powerful man can do is leave a room when he is asked. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the high window with her uncle's notebook open in her lap, and the book the Duke had sent her unopened on the bed, and the rain coming down soft and steady on the slates, and she did the arithmetic of it, over and over, because a part of her wanted to hate him, and it would have been so easy, so clean, so safe, to gather up the warm, dangerous thing that had been growing in her chest, and fold it back into the cold place, where it had lived 6 years, where it was safe, except that she kept seeing him, in the doorway of the stable in his shirt sleeves at first light, looking less like a duke and more like a man, holding a lantern over a dying mare 9 hours and giving no orders, breaking on the last word. I did not know, 22 years old. Late for a dinner, signing a page he did not read, which was, she understood, sitting at that window with the rain coming down. Exactly the kind of small, thoughtless, careless thing that a good man does once, and pays for. The rest of his life, she thought of her uncle, who had told her, the year she was 12, that the young Carrow boy had the right hands and the wrong friends. Her uncle had seen it. All those years ago, he had seen the whole of it, the decency, and the danger, in one boy, at one dinner, over a spilled cup of syllabub, and toward dawn, when the rain had stopped and the first gray light came up over the eastern hills, Cordelia Hayward did a thing she had not done in 6 years. She opened the book the Duke had sent, and she read the inscription, "To who has the right hands." And she understood, at last, what she was going to have to do. She was not going to hate him, because hate was easy, and she had done easy 6 years, and it had bought her nothing but an attic room and a borrowed name. She was going to do the harder thing. She was going to make him help her finish it. Because Sir Crispin Vane was coming to Blackmoor in 3 weeks. And there were only 2 people in all of England who could put him in front of out and break him. The niece who held the proof, and the Duke whose name was on the page. She closed the book. She looked out at the gold coming up over the hills. And somewhere down in the yard, a stable door worked on its hinges, and a great black stallion who leaned into no one's hand but hers put his head over the half-door, and whickered, low, into the cold spring morning, as if to say, it is nearly time. She came to him the next morning, not as a maid, not as a stable assistant, as something else, as a woman with a plan folded up tight behind her ribs and a notebook in her apron pocket. She found him at the long gallery window, where he had been standing too long. The way he stood at windows now, my lord, he turned, and his face, when he saw it was her, did a thing it had no permission to do. It opened, like a man who has been holding his breath underwater and has just broken the surface, Cordelia. "I did not think you would. I have not forgiven you, my lord." He stopped. "I want to be clear on that. Before I say the rest, I have not forgiven you. I do not know yet if I will be able to. That is a true thing, and I will not pretend it isn't. I understand, but I have decided that I am not going to let what you did 6 years ago be the last thing you ever do about it." A long silence in the gallery. The painted gentlemen watching from their frames. Sir Crispin Vane comes in 3 weeks, and I have spent 6 years learning to disappear from him. I am finished disappearing. I am going to put him in front of a crowd of breeders, and I am going to break him the way he broke my uncle. And I cannot do it alone. Tell me what you need. I need the Duke who signed the page to stand up in front of England and say that he signed it. The Duke went very still, because she was not asking him for money, or protection, or a soft word. She was asking him for the one thing a powerful man almost never gives. His own public ruin, they will say. He said slowly, that I was party to a fraud. Yes, my name will be in the magazines beside Vane's. Yes. It may cost me a great deal. Yes, it may. That is rather the point, my lord. An apology that cost you nothing. is not an apology. It is a convenience. And the Duke of Blackmoor looked at his master's niece, standing in his long gallery, asking him to set fire to his own good name, to clear the name of a dead man she had loved. And he understood in that moment that he had been waiting his whole life for someone to ask him to be brave, and had been terrified his whole life that no one ever would. "All right," he said, "just that. All right." So they spent 3 weeks building it, because Cordelia Hayward did not break men with passion. She broke them with paper. There was the notebook, her uncle's, 6 years of close-written pencil, and buried in the case notes, on a page dog-eared and water-stained, the confirmation diagram of a colt, a bay colt, with a particular whirl of hair at the base of the throat that no breeder could fake and no document could erase. And beside the diagram, in her uncle's hand, the colt's true pedigree, the real sire, the real dam, recorded the night before the sale, because Frederick Hayward, God rest him, had written down everything, and there was the bill of sale, the forged one, with the adjusted pedigree, and a duke's name witnessing it at the bottom, and the colt in the forged document, and the colt in her uncle's diagram, where the same animal, sold under a false name, for 4 times its worth, by Sir Crispin Vane. Put the 2 pages side by side, and any man with eyes could see it. But there was a difficulty, and Cordelia laid it before the Duke plainly, the way she laid everything before him now. She had the notebook, but the notebook alone proved nothing. A man could say a horse doctor scribbled anything in a private book. She needed the original bill of sale. The forged one. Forged one was not at Blackmoor. It was in the keeping of the man who had bought the colt, a man named Lord Carberry, who had lost a small fortune breeding from a worthless animal, and who had, 6 years ago, believed every word of the case against Frederick Hayward. The Duke wrote to him. It was the hardest letter he had ever written, because in it he had to confess, to a man he barely knew, the thing he had told no one in 6 years, and ask that man to dig out an old document from an old grievance and trust it to the post. Lord Carberry wrote back within the week. He had kept the bill of sale. He had kept it, he wrote, because something about the whole affair had never sat right with him. He sent gladly, and he added, at the bottom, in an old man's spidered hand, "I am glad to hear Hayward had someone left who believed him. I was not one of them. I should have been." Cordelia read that line 3 times, and then she folded the letter away, and said nothing, because there was work to do. The Duke wrote 2 more letters, to the Marquess of Brandwell, and to the old Earl of Severn, who had loved Frederick Hayward, and had never believed the charges against him for 1 single day. And both men wrote back, and both men said they would come, to the spring meeting, at Raisby, to stand where they were needed. And Locksley, old Locksley, who had wanted her gone, Locksley did a thing nobody asked of him. He went on his own old legs, to 3 men in 3 counties who had been at Tattersall's that Friday 6 years ago, and he came back with 3 written statements, in 3 shaking hands, each one saying the same thing, that Vane had vouched for the colt's blood with his own mouth, in front of witnesses. Before ever the sale went through, he laid them on the saddle store table, in front of Cordelia, and he did not say anything. He just set down his hat, and looked at her. "You did not have to do that, Mr. Locksley." "Aye," he said, "I did." And on the cold, bright morning the carriages began to arrive. For Raisby, Cordelia Hayward took out of the bottom of her uncle's old valise the one thing in the world that was truly hers, a riding habit, deep emerald green, cut high at the throat, military at the shoulder, narrow at the waist and full in the skirt, made for her by her uncle's wife, the spring she was 17, when there had still briefly been talk of a season in London. She had not worn it in 9 years. She had aired it 3 times by the backstairs window in the cold spring air, until the smell of cedar shavings gave way to the smell of green grass. She had let the hem down 1/2 an inch, with stitches no governess would have praised, but no horse would ever notice. She pinned a small jet brooch at the throat that had been her mother's, and she stood in front of the small cracked glass nailed to the back of her wardrobe door, and for a long, careful moment, she was not certain who was looking back at her. a woman in green, with her uncle's eyes, and her mother's brooch, and 6 years of silence, finally about to break. Behind her, in the doorway, Lady Beatrix watched. The child had insisted on being there. The child had insisted on a great many things. You look different, Cordelia. I look the same, my lady. You are not in your apron. No, I am not. You are wearing green. It belonged to a younger woman, my lady. I am borrowing it back from her. Beatrix considered this, the way she considered all of Cordelia's stranger sayings, as things that would make sense to her later when she was grown, and that she would therefore keep. Cordelia, yes, my lady, go and frighten him. Raisby was set in a long green meadow on the south side of the village, ringed by hawthorn hedges, just gone over into white mayflower, with the auction ring at its center, and a grandstand of weathered oak at the north end, and the canvas tents of half a dozen breeders, strung along the eastern hedge. The sky was the cool, clean blue of a morning that meant to behave itself. The grass was springy from the night's rain, and the air smelled of clean horses and hawthorn, and the warm sugar of the refreshment booth. There were perhaps 300 people on the ground, most of them men, most of them in dark coats and high boots, most of them carrying riding crops as though a riding crop were an item one ordinarily required at an outdoor breakfast. And Cordelia Hayward walked into the middle of all of it, on the Duke's arm, at 10:30 on a cold, bright Friday in May, and the cluster of breeders gathered by the auction ring went quiet in patches, the way grass goes quiet when a hawk's shadow crosses it. Sir Crispin Vane was at the rail. He was 48, and exceptionally good-looking in the way a winter wolf is good-looking, narrow, polished, exact, with very pale gray eyes and very dark hair, and the particular elegance of a man who had spent a great deal of money for a very long time on not being mistaken for anyone else. He wore midnight blue, his cravat edged in silver. He held a riding crop in one gloved hand and a price catalogue in the other, and he had been laughing at something when he saw the Duke walking toward him, with Cordelia Hayward on his arm. The laugh stopped. Blackmoor, Vane, you've brought your stable advisor, I have. How extraordinarily egalitarian of you. I find, said the Duke, with a small, polite smile that did not reach his eyes, that egalitarian arrangements yield superior livestock. And Cordelia released the Duke's arm, and she walked past Sir Crispin Vane, without looking at him. She walked along the rail of the auction ring, where a colt was being shown by a heavy-set groom with a strap arranged across the animal's withers, in a way any honest dealer would have recognized in 12 sections. She stopped opposite the colt. She rested her gloved hands on the rail, and she studied him for the slow count of 4, and then she turned her head a quarter inch and said, not loudly, but pitched to carry exactly to the gentleman beside her, "Who was the buyer, sir? You might ask the man to remove the strap." "The strap, miss?" "Across the withers, under the saddle pad. It is keeping a small swelling from your eye, and it is the swelling I should examine." Before I bid, the buyer was a wealthy farmer from Lincolnshire named Endersby, 8,000 a year, and a deep, good, honest distrust of London horsemen. He looked at Cordelia. He looked at the colt. He looked at the heavy-set groom whose ears had gone pink, and he turned to the auctioneer. "Have the strap off, sir, if you please." The strap came off. The swelling, the size of a hen's egg, was visible to every man within 20 feet of the rail, and it was the kind of swelling that in a 4-year-old meant a developing splint, which meant a horse that would be dead lame inside the year. Endersby closed his catalogue. "I do not bid, sir," and the colt was led away, and the auction ring, which had been quietly noisy, went quietly, completely silent, because every man at that rail had just watched a woman in an emerald habit do, in 15 seconds, the thing they all believed only they could do: see the truth of a horse. Sir Crispin Vane had not moved. He was looking at Cordelia the way a man looks at a glass he has dropped, which has, against all probability, refused to break, and then he understood who she was. She watched it cross his face, the dawning of it, the careful, pale, exact arithmetic of it, the narrow eyes going to her gold hair and her gray eyes, and the cut of a jaw he had seen once before. across a sail yard, on a man he had destroyed, Hayward, he said, very softly, so only she could hear. The little niece. They told me you'd gone into service. Scrubbing pots, I heard, in some attic somewhere. I was, sir, and now you bid on horses. On a duke's arm. A thin smile. How far the mighty have climbed. You have something you wish to say to me, Sir Crispin. Say it. I could finish you, he murmured, with a sentence. As I finished your uncle. And Cordelia Hayward looked at the man who had taken everything from her. 6 years ago. On a Friday afternoon, at Tattersall's, when she had been 20 years old, and she smiled, for the first time in his presence. She smiled. You finished me with a sentence once, sir. I have spent 6 years becoming very difficult to finish, and then she raised her voice. Not a shout. Cordelia Hayward never shouted. She had learned from a woman who never shouted. She simply lifted it and pitched it, the way she had pitched it at the rail, so that it carried across the auction ring, over the heads of 300 horsemen, clean and clear and final in the cold May air. Sir Crispin Vane, I should like to ask you, in front of these gentlemen, about a bay colt you sold at Tattersall's. 6 years ago this spring, the ground went still. 300 faces turned. I do not, said Vane, discuss business in a sail meadow with a stable girl. Then I shall discuss it for you. And she reached into the pocket of her emerald habit, and she drew out her uncle's notebook, and she opened it to the page she had marked, the page with the confirmation diagram, the whorl of hair at the throat, the true pedigree, recorded in a dead man's hand, the night before the sale, and she held it up. This colt was sold by Sir Crispin Vane as a son of the Eclipse line, for 400 guineas, to Lord Carbery, who lost half that again breeding from him before the truth came out, except the truth never did come out, because the man who knew it, the man who recorded the colt's true and worthless pedigree the night before the sale, was charged with the fraud himself, and ruined for it, and driven into his grave inside 2 years. She turned the page toward the crowd. That man was Frederick Hayward, of Newmarket, my uncle, and he was innocent, and I can prove it. A roar began to build at the edges of the crowd. The low, dangerous murmur of 300 men who had all, at one time or another, suspected exactly this, and had never had the proof, and were now watching the proof held up, in a gloved hand. In the morning sun, that, said Vane, and his voice had lost its silk, is the scribble of a disgraced horse-stuctor. It proves nothing. A child could have forged it. Then perhaps, said a new voice, deep, old, carrying the weight of 40 years at the rail. You will explain how it matches the original bill of sale. It was the Earl of Severn. He stepped through the parting crowd, with the Marquess of Brandwell at one shoulder, and Lord Carbery himself at the other. 3 of the oldest, greatest names in English bloodstock, and the Earl of Severn held, in his old spotted hand, a yellowed bill of sale. Lord Carbery kept the document, all these years, and he sent it to me a fortnight ago. And the pedigree on this bill, and the pedigree in young Miss Hayward's book, describe 2 different horses. With the same whorl at the throat, he let that land, which means one of them is a lie, and it is not the one written by a man with nothing to gain. The night before he was destroyed, Vane's face had gone the color of old tallow, and there is the matter, the Earl went on. Relentless now, gentle and terrible, the way only the very old can be terrible, of 3 gentlemen who were at Tattersall's that Friday, and who have set down in writing that Sir Crispin Vane vouched for that colt's blood with his own mouth, before the sale, which a horse doctor recording a true pedigree the night before could not possibly have arranged. He paused. And there is the matter of the witness. The bill of sale was witnessed, Sir Crispin, by a name that has troubled me for 6 years, because I could not understand how such a name came to be on such a page, and the meadow held its breath, because every man there knew the next name was a duke's, and every man there understood what it would cost the duke to own it. Sir Crispin Vane turned, slowly, to the Duke of Blackmoor, and on his ruined wolf's face, for the first time there was something almost like hope. Because here at last was his shield. Here was the great name that would never, could never, confess to standing beside him in the dark. Yes, said Vane, and the silk came back into his voice, slid back over it like ice over water. Tell them, Blackmoor, tell them whose name witnessed that sale. Tell them how. Closely. We once worked together, and the Duke of Blackmoor stepped forward. Into the center of the ring. Into the full cold light. With 300 faces turned toward him, and the whole of his good name balanced on the edge of the next thing he said. And Cordelia watched him, and she did not know. Even then, in that last held second, she did not know which way he would go, because she had not forgiven him. And because she had learned 6 years ago that powerful men protect themselves. That it is the first thing they do, and the last thing they do, and the only thing you can ever truly count on them to do. She watched the man she had let herself begin to love. Against every rule she owned. And she did not know, and the Duke of Blackmoor opened his mouth, and said, "The name that witnessed that sale was mine." A sound went through the crowd like wind through standing wheat. "I was 22, the Duke said, and his voice did not shake. He had decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that it would not shake, and I was a fool, and Sir Crispin Vane was my friend. Or so I believed. He put a paper in front of me and asked me to witness his signature, as a friend will do for a friend. And I signed it, without reading it, because I trusted him. And because I was late for a dinner, he turned. And he looked directly at Vane. I did not know what I was signing. I learned what I had done 2 years later, when I read in the magazine that Frederick Hayward, the man who taught me to ride, the man who gave me my first winner, had been ruined by a document bearing my name. And I was too much a coward, for 6 years, to say so. Until a woman walked into my house and rode my unrideable horse, and reminded me what my master had given me. "The right hands," he said, "and I have spent 6 years using them. To hold a glass of brandy. And do nothing." He looked back at the crowd. "I stand here today to tell you that Frederick Hayward was an innocent man, that the fraud was Vane's, and mine by my carelessness, and that any cost I pay for saying so is 6 years overdue." And the silence broke, not into shouting, into something worse for Vane, into the low contemptuous murmur of 300 horsemen turning their backs. One by one, the single most final sound in the English sporting world. The sound of a man being cut. Sir Crispin Vane stood alone at the rail, with his silver-edged cravat, and his polished boots, and his ruined wolf's face, and he understood, the way an animal understands weather, that it was over, that there was no sentence he could speak, no magazine he could write to, no great name left in all of England that would stand at his shoulder. He looked at Cordelia Hayward one last time. "You little." "Good morning, Sir Crispin," she said, and she turned her back on him too. He was gone within the hour, his carriage on the London road before the noon bells rang. And he never, as long as he lived, set foot at an English meeting again. She found the Duke at the kissing gate. It opened from the fairground onto the long meadow that lay between Raisby and the inn. A quarter hour by the cart road, a half hour by the field path, and there was no one in it but a thrush in a white-flowered hawthorn, and a pair of brown cattle, and the slanted gold light of an English May afternoon. She did not speak for the first half of the walk. He did not press her, and at the kissing gate she stopped, with one gloved hand on the wooden bar. My lord, Cordelia, I have been calm all morning, and I find that I am about to stop being calm, and I would rather not be observed." He looked deliberately at the empty meadow, at the thrush in the hawthorn. "The thrush," he said gravely, "holds poor opinions of all of us. Its discretion can be relied upon." And she laughed. It was the smallest laugh, and it was wet at the edges, and it was the first uncomplicated laugh she had laughed in his presence, and it broke the surface of her face open. Like a stone dropped into a still pond, she put her hand over her mouth. She turned her face away, and the Duke of Blackmoor set his hand on the small of her back, very gently, and did not move it, and she wept. Not for long, not loudly. The slow, steady weeping of a woman who had carried a thing 6 years and had set it down at last, and discovered, on setting it down, how much it had weighed. He did not pull her into his arms. He did not produce a handkerchief. He did not recite her any speeches. He stood beside her at the kissing gate with his hand on the small of her back, for the precise length of her weeping. And not a second past it, and when she had stopped, she stood very still. "My lord, Cordelia, I am not crying because of vain. No, I am crying because for 6 years I have done this with no one behind me, and I had got rather used to it, and I am finding, this afternoon, that I am not as accustomed to it as I supposed." He turned her, very gently. "To face him, Cordelia, I want you to come home with me, not as a servant, not as a project, not as a matter on which my conscience requires repair, although it does. I want you to come home as yourself, as my master's niece, as the woman who rode my unrideable stallion at first request, as the woman who broke Sir Crispin Vane in a sale meadow, with a notebook and a pedigree, and as the woman I have not stopped looking at since morning she laid a strand of mane in my hand and walked back to the kitchens, my lord. I am 30 seconds, Cordelia, from kissing you in this meadow, if you have any objection. This is the moment to raise it." She raised her face. The gray eyes met the storm-gray eyes, and she thought, briefly, of her uncle, of the wide blue April morning in the upper yard, of the right hands, and the wrong friends, and of a man who had, at last, got rid of the friends, the hard way, the expensive way, the only way that ever counts, my lord. "I have not yet forgiven you." A pause, but I find I am willing to work at it for the rest of my life. "If you are willing to be worked at," the Duke of Blackmoor began, "to smile. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. It was not meant to be romantic. It was meant to be honest, in you. They are the same thing." And he kissed her at the kissing gate, in a meadow in May, with the thrush watching from the hawthorn, the kind of kiss that does not need describing, restrained, charged, careful, and complete. The kind a man gives a woman when he has been quite certain about her for several weeks, and has that morning set fire to his own good name on her behalf, and arrived, punctual, at the next thing. When he stopped, she said, "My lord." He said, "Ambrose." She said, "Ambrose." He said, "Cordelia, will you marry me?" She said, "Not in this meadow." "Where then?" "At Blackmoor, in the chapel, when the foaling is done, and Juno is in foal again and carrying well, and my uncle's name is back in the magazine where it belongs. On conditions, as I expect, on conditions. Name them that I shall publish a treatise, in my own name, on the training of 2-year-olds. Before the year is out, yes, that I shall keep my room off the saddle store, and the key to it, and that I shall be at liberty to retreat there, for half an hour, any afternoon I please, without explanation. Yes, that my uncle's name shall be inscribed in the family chapel, beside your own father's." He went very still. "Yes," he said, quietly, "that one I should have offered, before you asked, and that I shall be addressed by Mr. Locksley, and by every man in the stables, as Miss Hayward, or Mrs. Carrow, or your Grace, as the case may be, but never, in any combination, as Sir Cordelia, and one more, Ambrose, anything, that, for the first year of our marriage at least, I shall be permitted to muck out a stall when I am cross with you, as an alternative to throwing things." And the Duke of Blackmoor, who was holding her by the small of her back, in a meadow in May, with a thrush approving from a hawthorn, and a horse fair in the distance, and the whole of the rest of his life in front of him, began to laugh. He laughed until he had to set his forehead. Briefly, against her shoulder, "Cordelia Hayward, yes, my lord, I love you. You will say it back. In your own time, in my own time, my lord." It was September before she said it. It was September because she would not be hurried, and because the foaling had run on through May, and because Juno had to be brought safe to a new foal that lived, and because the sporting magazine took until August to print the counterstatement, signed by the Earl of Severn and the Marquess of Brandwell and Lord Carbery, restoring Frederick Hayward of Newmarket to the place in the books that had been stolen from him. And because the chapel wanted painting, and because Lady Beatrix insisted on writing the order of service herself. The counterstatement, when it came, was a single column on the 3rd page. It did not say much. It said that new evidence had cleared the name of the late Frederick Hayward, that the fraud at Tattersall's had been the work of Sir Crispin Vane, that Mr. Hayward's records and reputation were restored in full. Cordelia read it once, standing in the yard, in the August sun, and then she walked out to the far paddock. Alone, and she stood at the rail, and she said to no one, in a voice barely above a breath, "There, uncle, there it is." And the wind came up over the dales, and moved through the long grass, and went on. She did not cry. Hendar crying at a kissing gate in May. This was something else. This was a thing being set down, and a door being closed, softly, on a room she would not need to enter again. She said it on the morning of her wedding. They were walking through the upper yard. There was a small dappled foal in the paddock beside Goliath's box, and Juno grazing easy beyond it, sound and whole. Goliath leaned his great black head over the half-door, and Cordelia was passing him a rough wedge of carrot, and Ambrose was watching her, the way he watched her now, like a man who cannot quite believe his own luck has held. And she turned, and she said, "Ambrose, Cordelia, I love you." He did not say "I know." He had been saving up, for months, the thing he meant to say back, and in the moment it came to him, he found he did not need it. He found he could only look at her. "You lifted me onto a stallion," she said, "in front of 7 people, to humble me." "I did, you may consider yourself. Humbled in perpetuity." He laughed. Goliath crunched the carrot. The dappled foal came up to her hand and nudged at her sleeve. And Cordelia Caro, who had been Cordelia Hayward, who had been the niece of Frederick Hayward of New Market, who had been a kitchen maid at Blackmoor a year before, and who was, at that present moment, the new Duchess of Blackmoor, set her warm hand against the bridge of her stallion's great black nose, and the bridge of his nose was warm in the September sun, and she looked at her Duke, and her Duke looked back, and somewhere in the dovecote a thrush sang 4 clear notes into the morning. And Mr. Locksley, watching from the doorway of the saddle store, took off his hat and held it against his chest, and said, very softly, to no one at all, "Aye, there she is."